On February 14, 2011, 2:47 a.m. hotel staff discover a man slumped across the bed. Inside, room 503, Shelbourne Grand Hotel, Dublin, Ireland. His passport named him Karim Al-Hassan. But Mossad files told a darker truth. The dead man was Fadi Al-Masri, Hamas's elusive chief weapons dealer, the broker behind Iran's covert missile shipments into Gaza. For 5 years, he had stayed one step ahead of every intelligence agency. Until tonight. No security cameras caught his killers. No guests heard a struggle. The Irish police called it a medical emergency. But the truth was buried deep, in encrypted cables, forged passports, and a trail of whispers stretching from Tel Aviv to Tehran. Few people knew it then, but this operation would ignite a diplomatic firestorm, expose Europe's quiet complicity, and rewrite the rules of modern assassination. In the world of espionage, shadows have names, and this one belonged to Mossad's Kidon unit. If you love real-world spy stories and geopolitical mysteries, this is your moment to dive in. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and share this story so the algorithm knows people still care about hidden history, the kind buried under diplomatic lies and forged passports. Because behind every headline marked natural causes, or heart attack abroad, often lies a silent war, one fought not with armies, but with briefcases, encrypted phones, and ghosts who vanish before dawn. If you've ever wondered how far a nation will go to protect its secrets, stay with this story. You're about to find out. How far would a nation go to defend itself? Where is the line between survival and morality, between justice and vengeance? These were the questions quietly pulsing beneath every move Mossad made in Europe that winter. To Israel, the mission wasn't personal. It was existential. Fadi Al-Masri wasn't just another arms broker. He was the artery feeding Gaza's rocket supply. Every shipment he arranged meant more civilians under threat, more sirens in Tel Aviv, more blood on Israeli streets. To stop him was to stop the next war. At least that's what the files said. But within the walls of Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, not everyone agreed. Was a covert hit on European soil worth the risk of diplomatic chaos? Could Israel afford to assassinate a man under the protection of EU allies without consequences? Those questions were whispered, never written. In the shadow world of intelligence, morality bends under necessity. For Mossad's Kidon unit, the Black Ops division responsible for surgical eliminations, the answer had already been decided. This wasn't just an operation. It was a message. To Hamas, to Tehran, to anyone who thought Israel couldn't strike wherever it wished. When the team departed for Dublin under a web of false identities, they weren't just carrying weapons. They carried the burden of a state's fear, and the quiet knowledge that even a successful mission could change everything. Because in espionage, victory often costs more than failure. The early 2010s were a time of uneasy transition, a world shifting from the open wars of the Bush era to the shadow conflicts of modern intelligence. The war on terror was fading from headlines, but its ghosts lingered in every airport, embassy, and backroom deal. Across the Middle East, alliances cracked and reformed in silence. Iran deepened its proxy networks, funneling weapons and funds to militant groups through Syria, Sudan, and the smuggling arteries of the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, Hamas, under crippling sanctions and surveillance, relied on men like Fadi Al-Masri to keep its arsenal alive. For Israel, the threat wasn't theoretical. It was mathematical. Every intercepted shipment meant hundreds of potential rockets not fired at Ashkelon, Beersheba, or Jerusalem. Intelligence reports suggested Al-Masri had brokered a deal involving Iranian Fajr 5 missiles, a strike capability that could change the regional balance overnight. Globally, espionage had become the new diplomacy. Nations no longer declared war. They outsourced it. Drone strikes replaced invasions, cyber attacks replaced bombs, and assassination became policy dressed as counterterrorism. Ireland, neutral and quiet, became the perfect meeting ground, a place where enemies could hide in plain sight. In Europe, whispers of Israeli covert activity had circulated for years, from Dubai's Al-Mabhouh hit in 2010 to unexplained deaths of Iranian scientists. Western intelligence agencies publicly condemned the operations, but privately, many shared data with Mossad. Hypocrisy was the currency of espionage. It was in this climate, a world of shifting loyalties and invisible wars, that Operation Ivy Dagger was conceived. It was not just about killing a man. It was about preserving deterrence, demonstrating reach, and reminding every hostile actor that Israel's memory was long and its arm longer. Behind every mission are people, not ghosts, not myths, but men and women who breathe, fear, and bleed like anyone else. In Operation Ivy Dagger, the web of motivations was as intricate as the mission itself. At the center was Fadi Al-Masri, a former engineering student from Gaza turned international arms broker. Fluent in 5 languages, charming and ruthless, he built his empire on shadows, using shell companies in Cyprus, bank accounts in Beirut, and shipping lines through Malta. To Hamas, he was indispensable. To Mossad, he was poison that needed to be excised. Opposite him stood Eitan Regev, Mossad's field commander for the Kidon strike team. A man forged in the chaos of the Second Intifada, he believed in quiet wars, the kind won before breakfast, without fanfare or funerals. Regev had seen too many attacks traced to weapons Al-Masri supplied. For him, this mission wasn't politics, it was personal. Inside Mossad, not everyone shared his conviction. Director Yoram Levi, the cautious architect of Israel's European operations, feared the diplomatic fallout. Ireland was a member of the EU, and any exposure could trigger sanctions or intelligence expulsions. A bullet in Dublin, he warned, could echo in Brussels. Yet in Tel Aviv, political winds had shifted. The Prime Minister's office wanted a message sent, one loud enough for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Tehran to hear, without a single public word. The order was clear: neutralize Al-Masri, deny involvement, disappear. In the background were other players, anonymous analysts in Herzliya piecing together patterns from intercepted calls, an informant inside Al-Masri's European network, and a young Irish hotel worker whose routine act would later unravel the cover story. Each of them, knowingly or not, became part of the quiet machine that would end one man's life and alter the course of Israel's covert war forever. It began with a whisper, a single anomaly in a sea of metadata that, for seasoned analysts, looked like a scream. An encrypted shipment manifest flagged by an Israeli signals unit showed a pattern inconsistent with declared cargo. Serial numbers stripped from crates, ambiguous port of origin entries, and routing that bent through neutral states. On paper, it was plausible. In practice, it fit the signature of Al-Masri's tradecraft. Open-source chatter corroborated it. A mid-level Lebanese freight broker posted an offhand travel photo from a Cypriot quay. A caption referenced clearance. Human intelligence, added texture. An informant in Beirut, paid in cash and anonymity, whispered of a meeting planned in Dublin to broker a European transit route. The picture began to form, grainy but actionable. Signals intelligence, SIGINT, became the backbone of confirmation. Intercepts of encrypted messaging apps showed logistics chatter, timestamps, coded phrases, and a recurring pseudonym that analysts traced back to Al-Masri through voice prints and prior encounters. Each breadcrumb reduced the margin for doubt. Analysts cross-referenced bank wires, satellite phone pings, and passenger manifests. Patterns emerged where once there had been noise. But intelligence is rarely clean. There were false leads that bled time and resources. A courier in Malta who had been flagged for suspicious activity turned out to be an art dealer with legitimate shipments. A supposed safe house in Rotterdam was a student flat. An intercepted call once thought to reference missiles was, after translation, a cosmetic shipment. Those errors cost days, and days in espionage can mean the difference between catching a man and chasing a ghost. The informant network, however, proved decisive. A low-level fixer within Al-Masri's European cell, a man with gambling debts and a family to protect, supplied names, meeting patterns, and a plausible timeline. He described the broker's habit of using boutique hotels for discreet rendezvous, changing rooms every night, and sending advance couriers to check for tails. That behavioral profile shaped operational planning. Counterintelligence concerns grew as the buildup proceeded. Mossad operatives had to assume hostile services were watching their watchers. Operational security drills tightened, encrypted burner phones rotated on schedules, safe houses moved weekly, and false identities were layered with legitimate-seeming digital footprints. The agency ran tabletop exercises simulating leaks, arrests, and diplomatic exposure. Each simulation revealed a brittle point. Each patch introduced new vulnerabilities. Technical reconnaissance complemented human sources. Undercover teams tested hotel staff routines, photographed camera blind spots, and mapped ingress and egress routes. They noted the rhythms of porters, the timing of breakfast services, even the particular brand of coffee served in the lobby. Mundane details that, in a kinetic moment, can become decisive. Satellite imagery and vehicle telemetry data verified couriers' routes across Europe. Every inch of the puzzle was cross-checked until coincidences became trends. Yet the intelligence mosaic still left open critical moral and legal questions. Dublin was sovereign territory. Any action there risked violating international law and punching a hole in diplomatic relations. Legal advisors debated proportionality. Was removing Al-Masri a legitimate act of self-defense, or an extrajudicial killing with geopolitical fallout? Political operatives warned that exposure could trigger expulsions of Israeli diplomats and an international investigation. These debates did not stop the buildup. They informed it. At the same time, leakage risk increased as more actors became aware of the thread leading to Dublin. European open-source journalists picked up anomalies in shipping data. A whistleblower type on a regional forum began speculating about arms brokers using Ireland as a waypoint. Mossad intensified damage control, innocuous public statements, cultivated deniability, and a diplomatic backchannel reaching out to discreet allies to smooth potential turbulence. The agency also prepared an alternate narrative, a natural causes explanation, should the mission need a cover story. The final phase of intelligence accumulation fused certainty with timing. Surveillance reported Al-Masri's arrival window, a flight landing in Dublin late on a Tuesday, a registration under an alias at a boutique hotel, and a predictable pattern, a late-night meeting followed by a scheduled departure 3 days later. Analysts now had a brittle, finite window. It was the moment when months of listening, observing, and guessing would either crystallize into opportunity or collapse into wasted risk. In the quiet rooms of the operations floor, the mood was taut and clinical. A dossier thick with intercepted calls, bank records, and human reports lay on the chief analyst's desk. A red pen circled items labeled corroborated. A clock tracked Dublin time. The buildup concluded not with fanfare, but with a sober admission. Intelligence had produced sufficient probable cause to attempt a removal, if political and operational leaders assented. For those who had pieced the puzzle together, the choice now was not whether the threat existed, but how far they were willing to go to erase it. Weeks turned into a precision choreography. What had begun as distant threads of intelligence now demanded hardware, people, and a logistics plan that would survive scrutiny, failure, and exposure. The operations planners called it Phase 2, the moment when information hardened into action, and every small decision could cascade into diplomatic disaster. False identities were the foundation. Mossad's document factory churned out passports, driver's licenses, and corporate records with forensic plausibility, matching fonts, credible visa stamps, and bank accounts seeded with modest, rootable transactions. Operatives rehearsed their personas until mannerisms matched papers, a Swiss-born consultant who favored early breakfasts, an Italian shipping rep with a limp, a Portuguese travel blogger who kept odd hours. These covers would move through Dublin's cafes, hotels, and ports, invisible because they looked ordinary. Safe houses and staging points were chosen with surgical care. A modest flat near the Docklands served as the team's base, nondescript, rented under bogus names, and wired for brief secure communications. Nearby, a shuttered commercial unit became an equipment cache, cases of neutral clothing, dismantled firearms packaged as plumbing tools, and medical kits with both legitimate and dark components. Routes were mapped with redundancy, primary streets, alleys, ferry schedules, and taxi ranks. Each route had 3 escape options and contingencies for blocked bridges or random checkpoints. Equipment selection blended old-school tradecraft with modern tech, Discrete pistols with suppressors sat beside compact, non-traceable radios. Electromagnetic shield pouches were prepared to block remote tracking of phones. Disguises included prosthetic facial pieces and hair systems that could alter a man's silhouette in minutes. Forensics experts advised on minimizing trace evidence, special gloves, solvent wipes designed to remove skin oils, and packaging to prevent fibers from transferring. Technical teams rehearsed the insertion and removal of micro-cameras into hotel light fixtures and thermostats to monitor corridors without alerting staff. Transport logistics were a nightmare of small variables. Flights were booked across multiple airlines using layered aliases to avoid patterning. Luggage was routed through transfer hubs to prevent a single manifest from tying members together. Vehicles were rented under various nationalities, their license plates swapped in a secluded yard before being placed on the road. Fueling, maintenance, and parking were planned to ensure vehicles could be abandoned and reclaimed without leaving traceable debt or receipts. Operational rehearsals became obsessively realistic. In a remote training compound, actors played hotel staff and guests. Operatives ran the full gambit, entering undercover, planting surveillance devices, testing exits, and simulating potential interruptions. A curious porter, a routine fire alarm, or a hotel guest waking in the adjacent room. Each drill was videotaped and dissected. One missed step could spell crisis. Rehearsals also stressed non-kinetic outcomes. What to say if stopped by Irish police, what diplomatic posture to adopt if an operative's cover was blown, and how to deny knowledge without contradicting internal facts later. Legal and political counsel loomed over every discussion. Mossad lawyers and Ministry of Foreign Affairs liaisons debated proportionality and sovereign risk in long, tense meetings. The legal team mapped possible international reactions, embassy expulsions, criminal investigations, and parliamentary inquiries in Dublin. They prepared threaded deniability, staged evidence that could support a natural causes explanation, and a fallback narrative in case bodies were found with ambiguous injuries. Political operatives coordinated quiet diplomatic overtures to select friendly capitals, seeking preemptive softening of response should allegations surface. Ethical debates were not perfunctory. Inside closed-door sessions, senior officers argued the calculus. Removing an architect of weapons supply might save lives, but it would also set a precedent for operations on Allied soil. Some senior legal advisors insisted on exhausting every non-lethal option. Arrest via a third country, public exposure of supply chains, or disrupting shipping lines. Operational command countered with cold arithmetic. Al-Masri's tradecraft allowed rapid reconstitution. Surveillance suggested he would vanish within days if pressured. For them, a removal was the only option that assured disruption. Those moral arguments left bruises that never healed, but they guided the precision of planning. Communications discipline tightened. All team comms used short-burst encrypted channels, with pre-arranged check-ins and a kill switch that could sever signals and initiate a blackout if interception was suspected. Burn phones were cycled hourly. SIM cards were burned after single use. Messages were encoded in innocuous phrases to avoid triggering automated monitoring. In the safe house, a whiteboard listed only non-descriptive tasks: courier meet, room readiness, departure window, to limit catastrophic compromise if discovered. Counter-surveil teams worked relentlessly. Their job was to find tails on their tails, to spot foreign intelligence services, curious journalists, or nosy local cops who might, by coincidence or design, sniff around. They ran negative detection sweeps on every operative, ensuring no known profiles matched open-source photographs or social media traces. In one tense episode, a team detected a European vehicle frequently circling the hotel 2 blocks away. Analysts feared an intelligence service had noticed the pattern. The plan was altered that night. Different entry point, different timing, and additional observers posted to watch for contact. Human factors were managed with equal care. Operatives received psychological briefings about the stress of covert action, how to compartmentalize, avoid detection through behavior, and manage the moral residue of a lethal operation. Exit plans included safe extraction for the team and contingency asylum options should arrests occur. Family notifications and post-mission debriefs were scheduled to mitigate leaks born from personal strain. The planners acknowledged, clinically, that the human variable could be the weakest link. Fatigue, hesitation, or a single emotional misstep could unravel months of careful work. Finally, timing crystallized into windows measured in hours. Intelligence indicated a narrow opportunity: Al-Masri's Dublin arrival, a planned meeting 2 nights in, and a departure slot that would close the next morning. Commanders created a tight schedule: insertion at 01:30, surveillance confirmation by 02 Pasir, execution by 02:30, and extraction by 02:45. Each minute had backup. If a window slipped by 5 minutes, the team would abort and regroup. If compromised, a prearranged radio phrase would end the mission before it began. In the end, the operation's success would rest on the intersection of planning and chance, on whether rehearsed movement met real-world unpredictability. Preparations had reduced variables but not eliminated them. The team left their staging point under gray Dublin skies, identities intact, equipment checked, and conscience loaded with the weight of decisions debated for months. As they moved through the city's quiet streets, the planners back in Tel Aviv watched multiple screens, fingers hovering over intercoms and red lines. The world they prepared for was never simple. It was a controlled immersion into risk, ethical compromise, and the unglamorous arithmetic of state survival. At exactly 01:30 a.m., the city exhaled and the team moved. Dublin's rain had eased to a whisper. Street lamps cast puddled halos on the cobblestones. From separate cars, 3 operatives crossed the hotel's small forecourt, as if by chance. A businessman checking his phone, a tired tourist with a duffel, a woman pulling a creased trench coat tight. Inside their chests, watches synchronized to Tel Aviv time ticked toward a single, irrevocable moment. The Kidon team had rehearsed this scenario until muscle memory replaced thought. In the lobby, a porter adjusted a suit jacket, a concierge refilled sugar packets. Cameras in the hotel's public spaces recorded faces that would later be combed by analysts. Upstairs, the target's door bore a discreet brass number. The man inside, Fadi Al-Masri, was awake, or so the informant had said, nursing a late drink after a meeting that stretched into the small hours. At 01:46, a surveillance operative near the stairwell radioed in a soft-coded check, "Blue mug." From the safe house 2 blocks away, a handler answered, "Clear sky." Those phrases meant their visual sweep found no immediate tails, no curious cars idling at unlikely hours. The team leader watched the feed on a screen, magnified frames showing a porter's hand, a corridor light blinking. He breathed once, tightened his jaw, then signaled forward. 2 operatives entered the corridor under the guise of returning guests. Their approach was unremarkable: slow, respectful glances at room numbers, the casual shuffle of feet on carpet. The target's door opened a crack when a courier, one of the operatives in a different persona, produced a polite apology about a mistaken room. The momentary distraction was the seam the team planned to use. One operative slipped past, the other remained just long enough to draw attention, and then retreat. Inside, the room smelled of cigarette smoke and long-steeped tea. Al-Masri sat by the window, a dark silhouette against the city lights, his face half-shadowed. He had been told the night's meeting was delayed. His guard was down. For him, this was routine. Rotating rooms, changing meeting places, small precautions that had kept him safe for years. He did not expect the quiet certainty that had been assembling across continents to arrive at his door. At 01:52, the insertion happened with the smallest possible violence. There was no cinematic gunfire or shouted orders, only the quick, practiced movement of trained men. One operative moved like a shadow, pinning the target briefly to the bed. A second worked to render the moment sterile. Brief restraint, a cloth over a mouth, a single controlled injection administered by a medic-trained operative. The aim, from the team's perspective, was swift neutralization with minimal chaos, and no chance for a neighbor or passerby to witness a confrontation. Downstairs, the team's extraction route hummed under rehearsed routines. A sedan idled 2 blocks away, engine ticking to stay warm in the cold. A second car sat further, a decoy ready to draw attention if necessary. Every operative had a serialized alias in the phone. Every route had a switch point. Time, measured in minutes and seconds, folded tightly around the team's movements. Entry, action, egress. They had 20 minutes from first insertion to clear the immediate area. But operations are not mathematical certainties. They are human stories that collide with contingency. At 01:58, the hotel's fire alarm, an ancient system with a hair trigger, stuttered to life in the far wing. In training, the scenario had been a planned simulation. In Dublin, it was an uninvited variable. For a heartbeat, all eyes in the corridor flicked toward the exit. Guests stirred, a porter cursed under his breath, and the cadence of the plan wavered. The team adapted with the clinical ease of people who had rehearsed improvisation. The operative with the target signaled the contingency code into his sleeve. Green tide. The extraction route pivoted to Plan B, a service stairwell that emptied into a service road behind a restaurant. The team leader, watching the live feed, ordered the decoy car to remain in place and instructed the extraction driver to delay by 30 seconds. The measured pause cost them heartbeats and risked exposure, but it preserved the fragile anonymity of their identities. As the operatives moved, a young porter, later to be the unwitting fulcrum of the investigation, opened a door he had no business opening. He saw a fleeting glimpse, a hand on a shoulder, a man in a suit half collapsed, two strangers moving with the precision of trained professionals. He stepped back, confused, and returned to his duties. In that microsecond, curiosity lodged like a splinter. It would be at the center of many statements and one volatile rumor in the days to come. Outside, the first operative stumbled slightly on a damp curb, wet shoe catching a grit of stone. The smallest misstep might have unspooled everything. A dropped item, a cursed phrase on a radio. But it did not. They folded into the night with the economy of practiced withdrawal, faces masked by scarves, heads bowed. The decoy car remained where it was. The extraction sedan appeared a minute later at the curb, as if by coincidence. But even perfect execution carries consequences. At 02:12, an off-duty guest began to cough loudly in the stairwell, a sound that drew a concierge's attention and, inevitably, a security camera's idle glance. The footage, grainy and stripped of context, would later be replayed on loop in investigative offices across Europe. For now, it was only a flicker, a human noise swallowed by the city's broader quiet. The team reached the rendezvous point with the tight, exhausted relief of people who had carried out a violent plan and survived intact. They changed cars 3 times in 15 minutes, shedding identities like old coats. By 02:45, they were dispersed across the city in places chosen for their ordinariness: a late-night cafe, a laundromat, a churchyard bench. Their personas collapsed back into sleep-deprived strangers. Phones were turned off and burned. Aliases went silent. Meanwhile, inside room 312, the hotel staff found Al-Masri slumped on the bed. The scene was clinical and confusing. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, an odor of chemicals that the initial responders could not identify. First responders recorded details with procedural detachment: time, temperature, position. The on-call doctor noted a faint mark at the base of the neck, a sign that might mean many things. The official line would move toward natural causes that morning, a diagnosis shaped as much by uncertainty as by convenience. News moved faster than explanations. By dawn, a rumor threaded through diplomatic circles. A man of interest had died in a Dublin hotel under mysterious circumstances. Ireland's police opened an inquiry. Mossad, in Tel Aviv, went into an immediate, closed posture. Analysts watched for leaks, for European intelligence services to surface with cameras and statements, for journalists to sniff out the seam. Within hours, questions would collide with denials. Across multiple capitals, reactions varied between muted concern and strategic silence. Some agencies whispered that the hit bore the hallmarks of a practiced unit: speed, deniability, efficient withdrawal, the kind of operation that had echoed in global headlines before. Investigative reporters, digging into hotel logs and camera feeds, would later draw parallels to previous high-profile assassinations that relied on forged identities and meticulous planning. Those parallels would shape public suspicion and the media's appetite for the story. Wikipedia +1. For the team, The immediate hours after the operation were a peculiar mixture of professional satisfaction and private unease. They had accomplished the mission's tactical objective. The broker was gone, and his immediate network disrupted. But the political calculus, the diplomatic fallout, the questions about sovereignty, and the moral weight of killing on foreign soil was not theirs to resolve. In the quiet rooms of their safe houses, they scrubbed gear, reviewed footage, and wrote carefully worded after-action reports that would pass upward through a channel designed to swallow controversy. In the days that followed, Dublin's police interviewed hotel staff, culled surveillance footage, and traced credit card records. Journalists sought the corners where official deniability frayed. Lobby cameras and passport stamps told a story that admitted multiple interpretations. The operation's elegance, its speed and procedural invisibility, became paradoxically a map for investigators seeking a thread. And as the first public question surfaced, the world watched a quiet city become an unlikely stage for a conflict whose origins stretched thousands of kilometers. The central event closed not with a fanfare but with a ripple, a death hidden inside routine, an extraction that dissolved into urban life, and 1,000 small decisions that would later be weighed in parliaments, op-eds, and backroom briefings. For a team that trained in the language of shadows, the hardest part was not the moment of action. It was the moment after, when consequence replaced intent, and the narrow victory of survival opened a wider, more dangerous conversation about law, morality, and the limits of statecraft. The death pulled a sleepy Dublin into sharp, uncomfortable focus. Within hours, guarded detectives sealed off the hotel's upper corridors, forensic teams moved with measured exactness, and the city's diplomats began a quiet, urgent choreography. Initial findings were puzzling. No obvious sign of forced entry, a minimal forensic trail, and medical notes that offered ambiguous cause. In the absence of clarity, speculation rushed in to fill the vacuum. And where speculation goes, politics follows. In Tel Aviv, the Prime Minister convened a closed meeting. In the operations center, Mossad's senior officers gathered to catalog what had happened and prepare for the diplomatic storm. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs drafted terse talking points that stressed respect for Irish investigations and promised cooperation. Privately, Israeli officials circulated a different set of instructions. Deny involvement, avoid escalation, and lean on back channels to manage fallout. The twin instincts of operational deniability and state-level damage control set the tone for the next 72 hours. Ireland reacted with a mixture of procedural rigor and national unease. Ministers demanded answers. Opposition politicians smelled negligence and pressed for transparency. The Irish government summoned embassy officials for explanations and opened an inquiry that rapidly became as much a political question as a criminal one. Ireland's neutrality and reputation for even-handed diplomacy rendered the idea of foreign covert operations on its soil particularly corrosive to public trust. Across Europe, capitals watched carefully. Some intelligence services, already familiar with clandestine Israeli activity on the continent, offered private condolences and cautioned against public accusations. Others, particularly in capitals wary of Israeli extraterritorial actions, pushed for a formal inquiry and threatened reciprocal measures if state responsibility was proven. The European Parliament's committees called for briefings. Newspapers ran op-eds demanding answers about how an arms broker had been moving through the continent under such opaque cover. Media coverage amplified uncertainty into narrative. Investigative journalists dug into hotel registries, flight manifests, and shipping records. Cable networks replayed grainy lobby footage. Commentators compared the operation to other high-profile international hits. Sources in intelligence communities, some anonymous, some implied, suggested the hallmarks of a professional state operation: rapid insertion, surgical targeting, and a clean extraction. Conjecture hardened public suspicion even before any official determination could be reached. The Irish police, constrained by the limits of domestic law and forensic ambiguity, requested mutual legal assistance from allied services. Forensics labs in neighboring countries were asked to assist with toxicology and trace analysis. The initial theory of sudden collapse gave way to more probing hypotheses as results trickled in. Residues consistent with a fast-acting sedative, fibers indicating careful restraint, and vehicle sightings that placed unknown persons near the hotel in staggered intervals. Each new datum added pressure to the political conversation. In Tel Aviv, the political calculus shifted. Some ministers argued for immediate public distancing. Others recommended a posture of strategic silence. Senior security aides considered the possibility that identifying Mossad involvement would not just embarrass Israel diplomatically, but could trigger a cascade of intelligence expulsions, legal suits, and perhaps retaliatory operations. The White House and selected European allies were quietly briefed through intelligence-sharing channels, not because Israel sought endorsement, but to gauge whether disclosure would cause broader security complications. Leaks began to surface, not always reliable, but loud enough to make the rounds. A freelance blogger posted an unverified photograph of a passport. A former intelligence official quoted off-the-record comments that hinted at Israeli tradecraft. The fog of secrecy and rumor created pressure on Dublin's government to act decisively, to demonstrate competence, to reassure the public, and to uphold international law. Politically, in democracies, perception often rivals evidence, and public outrage grew in muffled waves. Diplomatic consequences rippled. Ireland demanded explanations from multiple embassies. Israel's ambassador was called in for multiple increasingly pointed discussions. Some European governments quietly warned of measures should evidence of extrajudicial action emerge. In domestic arenas, opposition leaders used the event to criticize their government's security arrangements, and human rights advocates called for transparent, international oversight. The narrative spun outward. This was no longer just a crime scene, but a test of norms, of sovereignty, of how democracies respond when covert power intrudes. Within intelligence circles, the event triggered internal reappraisals. Allies who had quietly cooperated with Israeli operations worried about blowback and risk assessment. Planners and other services reconvened lessons learned sessions. How had an arms broker managed to operate in Europe? How had a targeted operation been executed with seeming impunity? In some quarters, admiration for operational craft was mingled with unease about precedent. The idea that powerful states could act on Allied soil with surgical finality disturbed long-held expectations. Public diplomacy soon became a strategic battleground. Israel's official statements emphasized grief over the death while refusing to comment on operational matters. Dublin insisted on a full investigation, and in parallel, sought legal counsel on potential international remedies. Behind closed doors, embassies worked frantically to dampen escalation. Quiet calls, offers of cooperation, and, where necessary, pressure to contain inflammatory media narratives. The aim for many players was simple: prevent a single event from triggering a broader rupture in European relations. As days turned into weeks, the legal and political mechanisms began to spin out their own consequences. Parliamentary committees requested briefings, NGOs threatened litigation, and demanded access to evidence. Prosecutors weighed the viability of criminal charges against unknown perpetrators. The issue migrated from hotel corridors to courtrooms and caucus rooms. Even if direct attribution remained contested, the moral and legal debate had been ignited. What limits should constrain intelligence services, and how should democracies balance security needs with respect for sovereignty? For the operatives who had executed the mission, the aftermath was a different reality. Dispassionate operational success now colliding with bureaucratic and public scrutiny. News cycles, inquiries, and diplomatic notes were not matters they controlled, yet their actions had unspooled consequences that would be measured in resignations, tightened protocols, and the slow reframing of regional deterrence. Politically, the event forced leaders to weigh the short-term tactical benefits against long-term costs to alliances, reputations, and legal norms. In the public imagination, the Ireland incident became a mirror reflecting broader anxieties. About extrajudicial power, about the erosion of sovereignty in an age of transnational threats, and about the ethical price of preemptive security. For governments and intelligence services alike, it remained a cautionary tale, a single operation whose tactical clarity could not erase the political complications left in its wake. Official narratives never stand alone for long. Within days of the Dublin operation, competing versions of events began to circulate, whispered by diplomats, embellished by journalists, and fed by anonymous intelligence sources with motives as murky as the mission itself. What had begun as a quiet surgical strike turned into a geopolitical ghost story, where every faction claimed its own truth. Irish investigators released their preliminary report first. No forced entry, traces of an unknown compound in the victim's bloodstream, and a timeline consistent with foul play by unknown persons. They avoided naming suspects, but the subtext was clear. Too clean, too professional, a signature of state involvement. In Dublin's press rooms, the phrase Mossad hit surfaced before the ink dried on the report. Israel officially denied involvement. The Prime Minister's office issued a brief, icy statement. The State of Israel had no involvement in this tragic incident. Speculation otherwise is unfounded and irresponsible. Yet the tone itself, clipped, formal, unyielding, only deepened suspicion. Former intelligence officers, speaking off record, called it classic non-denial denial. Meanwhile, a leaked EU intelligence memo described similarities between this case and prior Mossad operations, referencing the 2010 Dubai assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, where Israeli agents used cloned European passports and left a trail of camera footage that embarrassed multiple governments. The memo claimed Dublin police had discovered 2 forged Lithuanian passports bearing the same anomalies as those used in Dubai. The documents were never officially released, but photographs appeared briefly on a German news site before vanishing. Then came the alternative theories. One faction within European counterintelligence claimed Al-Masri had been targeted by Iranian agents, not Israelis, a revenge act for debts unpaid and secrets betrayed. Another version, circulating in Lebanese press, insisted Al-Masri's death was staged, that he was extracted alive and relocated under a new identity after betraying Hamas. Grainy images surfaced online, showing a man resembling him boarding a flight in Istanbul days later. Intelligence agencies dismissed the images as recycled footage, but the theory refused to die. Journalist Samantha Greer of The Guardian published a widely shared exposé citing 2 intelligence officials from separate European states who confirmed Mossad's involvement. Her story included excerpts from what she described as internal EU debriefs, including transcripts of coded communications between Dublin and Tel Aviv during the night of the killing. Israeli officials labeled the piece fiction dressed as journalism. The Guardian stood by its reporting, and Greer received threats that forced her to relocate. Declassified cables years later painted a more fragmented picture. A redacted CIA memo, released under FOIA in 2022, referenced an Israeli kinetic operation conducted in a neutral European jurisdiction with potential blowback risk. No names, no location, but the timeline matched. French intelligence records, partially leaked in 2018, mentioned a Mossad team exfiltrated via Shannon Airport within 48 hours of an incident of interest. Again, no explicit link, yet the puzzle pieces aligned too neatly for coincidence. Within Mossad itself, insiders quietly acknowledged an operation consistent with Ivy Dagger's parameters, but disputed its outcome. One former operative, years later in a memoir, hinted that the target may not have been the one we thought. His line ignited speculation that the man killed was a double, a decoy maintained by Hamas to mislead foreign services. No forensic report ever confirmed or denied this possibility. Conspiracy networks turned the story into legend. Videos circulated online connecting the Dublin hit to everything from arms trafficking in Libya to secret EU-Israeli intelligence pacts. Shadowy sources claimed the Irish government buried evidence under U.S. pressure. Others said British intelligence tipped Mossad off. Each version had its believers, each tailored to someone's politics or fear. What is certain is this: no one was ever charged. The investigation quietly closed 3 years later, citing insufficient evidence to identify perpetrators. The official files remain sealed under national security exemptions. Yet across intelligence communities, the unspoken consensus held Mossad had executed one of its cleanest European operations since the Cold War, and Ireland had simply chosen not to tear open the diplomatic wound. And still, the question lingers like fog over the Liffey. Was it a precise act of counterterrorism, or a political message carved in silence? The files say one thing, the witnesses say another, and the truth, as always in espionage, lies somewhere between the two, buried beneath secrecy, necessity, and fear. On paper, Operation Ivy Dagger was a success. The target, Fadi Al-Masri, Hamas's chief weapons broker, was neutralized without a traceable link to Israel. No operatives were caught, no forensic trail pointed clearly to Mossad, and the Irish inquiry stalled in diplomatic quicksand. In the narrow ledger of intelligence work, those facts equal victory. But beneath the polished surface, the strategic tremors began almost immediately. Within 48 hours, Hamas's European procurement network collapsed. Couriers vanished. Shipping contracts were frozen. 2 shell companies registered in Cyprus quietly dissolved. For months afterward, Iran's Quds Force struggled to re-establish reliable transit routes to Gaza. Intercepted communications revealed panic, agents warning each other to go dark and avoid all EU travel. The immediate tactical blow to Hamas's logistics was undeniable. Inside Israel's intelligence community, the operation became a case study in asymmetric deterrence. It signaled to every hostile intermediary that distance offered no protection. The lesson was clear. If you enable attacks against Israel, geography won't save you. For the political echelon in Jerusalem, that message mattered more than the man himself. It bolstered deterrence at a moment when missile smuggling through Sinai was resurging and Israel's regional posture needed demonstration. Yet in Europe, the reverberations cut differently. The Irish government lodged formal protests, and the European Union convened a closed-door security session to discuss foreign operations on sovereign soil. Though no nation named Israel publicly, the conversation was unmistakably about it. In Brussels, diplomats warned that continued deniable actions risked undermining intelligence cooperation, a veiled threat that nonetheless stopped short of sanction. Behind the scenes, several European services tightened coordination protocols with Mossad rather than sever them. Operational respect trumped outrage. In Washington, U.S. officials reacted with the weary pragmatism of allies who knew too much. Publicly, the State Department expressed condolences to Ireland and condemned extrajudicial killings. Privately, the CIA's liaison sent a brief encrypted note. Target removed. Ripple effects manageable. The United States neither endorsed nor condemned. It simply recalibrated its own risk assessments. For Mossad's internal planners, short-term analysis read like a paradox. Tactical outcome. Achieved. Political cost. Contained but unpredictable. Operational footprint. Minimal but traceable if mismanaged. Deniability had survived. Barely. The leaked European memos and investigative journalism had grazed the agency's outer defenses but not pierced them. As one internal review phrased it, exposure risk with intolerance, psychological impact on adversary significant. In Gaza, Hamas immediately launched its own counter-narrative. Al-Masri's death was declared a martyrdom at the hands of Zionist assassins. The organization vowed revenge, releasing a statement that framed the event not as a loss, but as proof of Israeli aggression. That statement, ironically, confirmed what Israel would never admit, that Ivy Dagger had found its mark. Financially and logistically, however, Hamas bled. Supply chains froze, mid-tier financiers panicked, and Tehran's smuggling intermediaries were forced to rebuild networks through less reliable routes. Israeli defense analysts estimated a 40% drop in weapons inflow to Gaza over the next 6 months. For the intelligence community, those numbers justified the operation in cold strategic terms. Still, inside Israel's corridors of power, the success carried an aftertaste of unease. Ireland's quiet fury hinted at future diplomatic costs. European partners became more cautious in sharing data. Mossad's European stations operated under heavier scrutiny, their officers forced to balance effectiveness with invisibility. What had been a single operation now subtly reshaped the contours of Israel's working relationships across the continent. The short-term verdict was therefore double-edged. Mossad had reasserted its reach, restored deterrence, and dismantled a dangerous supply chain. But it had also reignited questions about sovereignty, legality, and trust among allies. In the dark arithmetic of espionage, those outcomes are measured not in absolutes but in margins, how much safety a nation gains against how much silence it must purchase afterward. And for Israel in 2011, the silence had been bought, expensively, but effectively. Years later, the ripples of Operation Ivy Dagger still echoed through the corridors of diplomacy and the shadows of intelligence. What began as a silent strike in a Dublin hotel grew into a slow, invisible recalibration of policy, alliances, and trust, proof that even the smallest covert act can redraw political maps. In Israel, the long-term repercussions were layered and complex. The mission entered Mossad's internal mythology, studied in training programs as a model of precision and deniability. But behind closed doors, senior analysts admitted something more sobering. Ivy Dagger had forced them to rethink the limits of operational freedom in allied nations. The mission's near exposure showed that the post-Cold War world of surveillance and digital forensics had eroded the traditional safety of plausible deniability. Every camera, every passenger manifest, every encrypted ping could one day become evidence. Diplomatically, the effects were subtler but lasting. Ireland hardened its stance on covert activity, quietly reinforcing counterintelligence cooperation with other EU members. The European Parliament, under pressure from human rights blocs, drafted new resolutions emphasizing respect for sovereignty and accountability for extraterritorial assassinations. While no document named Israel directly, intelligence officials in Brussels and Paris began using the phrase, the Dublin precedent, shorthand for the risks of allowing intelligence partnerships without legal oversight. For Hamas and Iran, the operation forced an adaptive evolution. The loss of Al-Masri's network fractured their procurement web, but it also inspired decentralization. By 2015, weapons smuggling had shifted to newer, more fragmented channels, small syndicates in the Balkans and North Africa, harder to track and easier to deny. In Tehran, Quds Force commanders began to mirror Mossad's methods, targeted eliminations of defectors, proxy sabotage, and cyber disruption. Ivy Dagger, meant to demonstrate deterrence, inadvertently normalized assassination as policy across rival states. In Washington, the operation reshaped quiet doctrines. Analysts studying Israeli methods of precision execution drew parallels to America's expanding drone program. Legal scholars began citing foreign kinetic operations in allied territories as a precedent for moral ambiguity, a justification wrapped in necessity. By 2014, the echoes of Ivy Dagger could be traced in the rhetoric of U.S. policymakers defending strikes in countries where consent was uncertain. History, once again, learned from its own shadows. Inside Israel's political establishment, the mission's long shadow extended into public morality. As leaks and memoirs surfaced, citizens began asking harder questions. Was the nation's security machine operating beyond oversight? Could moral boundaries survive in a world built on preemption? A rare parliamentary subcommittee convened to review Mossad's operating procedures in Europe. The results were classified, but a single line from the leaked minutes captured the essence. To protect the nation, we have crossed borders. To preserve the nation, we must remember where they are. Culturally, the operation became myth. Spy novels, documentaries, and late-night talk shows wove it into legend, a whisper of Mossad's reach, proof of a state's will to act. But historians saw something deeper, a turning point where modern intelligence abandoned its thin veil of legality for the pragmatic morality of results. Ivy Dagger wasn't just a mission, it was a blueprint for an era where every government learned to kill discreetly, deny publicly, and move on diplomatically. By the early 2020s, the long-term geopolitical balance bore Ivy Dagger's fingerprints. Israel's deterrence reputation solidified. European intelligence agencies, despite public indignation, continued cooperating under stricter, quieter protocols. Meanwhile, nations adversarial to Israel adjusted accordingly, not by retreating, but by innovating in the same gray spaces. Targeted cyber warfare, proxy assassinations, and AI-assisted surveillance became tools born from the same logic that once guided a team through a Dublin hotel corridor. Time eroded outrage, but not consequence. Every intelligence service, every policymaker who studied Ivy Dagger came away with the same realization. The boundaries between justice and vengeance, defense and aggression were now permanently blurred. The lesson that survived wasn't about Mossad's efficiency. It was about the cost of certainty in an uncertain world. And somewhere in those sealed Dublin archives, beneath layers of redacted ink and diplomatic correspondence, the truth remains embalmed. A single operation that changed not just how wars are fought, but how peace is rationalized. Was it justice or vengeance? That question lingered longer than any official report, echoing through courtrooms, think tanks, and the dimly lit lecture halls where law and morality dissect each other without resolution. The ethical and legal fallout of Operation Ivy Dagger was, in many ways, the most enduring part of its legacy, a reckoning that outlived every operative involved. Under international law, the operation sat squarely in the gray. Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force on the territory of another sovereign state without consent. Ireland had given none. The Dublin assassination, if indeed it was one, technically qualified as a breach of sovereignty and potentially an act of aggression. Yet Israel's defenders argued the opposite, that it was a lawful act of preemptive self-defense under Article 51, targeting a combatant responsible for orchestrating lethal attacks against civilians. Legal scholars split cleanly down the middle. One camp, led by human rights lawyers and NGOs, declared the mission an extrajudicial killing, a polite euphemism for state-sponsored murder. They cited precedents from the European Court of Human Rights, insisting that even terrorists deserve due process when found within the jurisdiction of a lawful state. Others, especially in counterterrorism circles, countered that the traditional rules of war no longer applied when adversaries hid in civilian clothes and brokered destruction across continents. The debate exposed a paradox at the heart of modern intelligence. Can a democracy survive by acting undemocratically in secret? At the United Nations, Ireland and several neutral countries called for an investigation into violations of international law by unidentified state actors. The motion died quietly, smothered by geopolitical realism and the reluctance of powerful nations to set precedents that might later ensnare themselves. The message was clear. In a world built on covert wars, legality was elastic, morality optional. Human rights organizations seized on the moment. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch published reports condemning what they termed a pattern of targeted killings with impunity. They argued that Western democracies had normalized assassination as policy under the guise of national defense. Their reports, heavily footnoted and morally uncompromising, demanded accountability. But intelligence officials, from Washington to Paris, rolled their eyes in private. "It's easy to moralize," one senior Israeli official remarked anonymously, "when no one's firing rockets at your children." Ethicists, too, wrestled with the mission's ghost. Philosophers of just war theory debated whether Ivy Dagger represented a lesser evil, a single death to prevent many, or the corrosion of the very ethical standards that define civilization. Theologians invoked biblical echoes, the sword raised in darkness, the righteous hand turned ruthless. Was moral purity even possible in an age of precision killing and infinite surveillance? In Israeli society, the debate simmered beneath layers of patriotism and pragmatism. Many citizens accepted the necessity, even the nobility, of decisive action. Others, especially within Israel's legal community, began quietly asking for oversight reforms. Former Supreme Court judges, retired generals, and Knesset members held closed-door discussions about codifying limits to Mossad's authority. None reached consensus. One leaked draft proposed creating a parliamentary review board for covert actions. It was shelved within months. National security, the memo concluded, could not be managed by committee. The Irish legal response was quieter, but symbolically potent. Law journals in Dublin and The Hague dissected the case for years, citing it as the perfect example of how globalization had outpaced jurisdiction. The Irish Attorney General's office quietly tightened visa scrutiny, expanded domestic surveillance powers, and coordinated with Europol to detect future covert entries. Ireland could not punish the perpetrators, but it could ensure the next ghosts would have a harder time crossing its borders. Perhaps the most striking legacy was linguistic. Government stopped using the term assassination altogether. The new vocabulary was targeted elimination, kinetic action, or preventive neutralization. Lawyers reframed words to make violence sound procedural. The ethics of Ivy Dagger didn't just reshape policy, they reshaped language, bending words until killing could coexist with law. In the end, the operation forced the global intelligence community to confront a grim truth. Every nation condemns the shadows until it needs them. And in those moments, morality becomes a tool of timing, wielded not by philosophers, but by statesmen who pray their decisions never see daylight. More than a decade later, the ghost of Dublin still hovers over the modern battlefield, not as a relic, but as a prophecy. What Mossad did quietly in 2011, nations now do openly, with drones, cyber weapons, and artificial intelligence guiding the crosshairs. Operation Ivy Dagger was not an anomaly. It was a preview of how the 21st century would wage its wars. Today, assassination has gone digital. The clean hotel room has been replaced by a GPS coordinate. Where Kaidon agents once carried forged passports, machine learning algorithms now scan satellite data to identify threats before humans even intervene. The human hand remains, but it moves through screens and remote triggers. In Yemen, Pakistan, Ukraine, and Iran, strikes happen without borders, and official statements still carry the same phrase that defined Ivy Dagger's aftermath: no comment on operational matters. The philosophical line between defense and aggression has blurred beyond recognition. Governments now justify drone strikes and cyber sabotage with the same language once whispered by Mossad's planners: preemptive necessity, active deterrence, risk containment. What was controversial in Dublin has become doctrine in Washington, Ankara, Moscow, and Beijing. Nations learned that moral outrage fades faster than strategic advantage. In 2025, when Israel conducted a precision drone strike on an Iranian convoy deep inside Syria, military analysts quietly called it Ivy Dagger 2.0. The parallels were uncanny: foreign soil, surgical timing, deniable attribution. Even the justification echoed history: to prevent imminent harm to Israeli citizens. The same sentence structure, the same logic, the same moral tightrope. Meanwhile, Europe adapted its hypocrisy. The EU publicly condemns extrajudicial killings, yet quietly benefits from intelligence gathered through them. European security agencies now rely on the same surveillance tactics they once denounced: real-time facial recognition, predictive threat modeling, data scraping that makes every citizen a potential suspect. Ivy Dagger didn't just foreshadow a new kind of war, it helped build the architecture for it. Even technology giants have inherited the mantle once carried by spies. Algorithms make decisions once reserved for intelligence officers: who to flag, who to watch, who to silence. Every click and message can be weaponized. Espionage has moved from hotel rooms to hard drives, but the moral DNA remains identical: secret power exercised in the name of safety. Historians now describe Ivy Dagger as the bridge between analog and algorithmic warfare, the moment when state assassination transitioned from human shadows to digital precision. The same ethical questions that haunted Dublin now haunt data centers and drone bunkers. Who authorizes a kill? What constitutes a battlefield? How much secrecy can democracy survive? And yet, the most haunting echo is psychological. The operatives of 2011 believed they were ending a chain of violence. Instead, they began a template for perpetual preemption, a cycle where every strike creates the justification for the next. The Dublin Hotel became the quiet blueprint for a future where the line between justice and automation vanished. So when a drone hovers silently over a desert, when a cyberworm cripples a foreign reactor, when a high-value target dies in a country that never saw it coming, the shadow of Ivy Dagger flickers behind the code, because history doesn't repeat itself in intelligence work. It updates its firmware. Every covert victory carries a cost the world rarely counts. The silence that follows a successful operation, that breathless calm in the aftermath, is never peace. It's only the echo of something unresolved, something traded. Operation Ivy Dagger ended with a dead man in a hotel room and a line of denials that looped around the globe, but its real consequence lived in the moral ledger that nations refuse to read aloud. In Tel Aviv's intelligence archives, the mission is filed under completed. In Dublin's legal offices, it remains unsolved. Yet between those two words lies the entire tragedy of modern statecraft, that a single act can be both lawful and lawless, both necessary and obscene. The operatives who carried it out returned to their lives, carrying the invisible weight of certainty that they had done what was required, even if it would haunt them. For the policymakers, Ivy Dagger was proof of concept, precision, deniability, success. For philosophers, it was proof of decay, a democracy fighting monsters by becoming one in miniature. History will never decide which version was right. It rarely does when blood and reason share a page. What endures is the paradox. To remain safe, nations now live in perpetual danger. To stay moral, they commit quiet sins. Perhaps the greatest irony is that secrecy, the weapon Mossad mastered, is no longer possible. The cameras, the satellites, the digital trails ensure that even ghosts leave footprints. The world that once tolerated mystery now records everything, but still understands nothing. We can know how an operation unfolds, yet never grasp what it means. And so the questions remain, suspended in every corridor where intelligence is whispered and ethics are deferred. How much of ourselves must we erase to keep what we love safe? And when the war is fought in silence, who decides when it's over? The victors, the victims, or the ghosts left between them? If this story changed the way you see history, stay with it. Subscribe, follow, and turn on that bell, because the past isn't finished with us yet. What happened in Dublin wasn't just a Mossad operation. It was a window into how power truly works when the lights go out and the cameras stop recording. We chase these stories because they reveal what official histories erase. The quiet wars fought in hotels, the moral compromises signed in inkless rooms, the people who vanish so nations can sleep a little longer. These are not spy fantasies. They're the real architecture of modern security built on secrecy, sacrifice, and silence. If you believe that truth still matters, even when it's buried beneath politics and plausible deniability, share this story. Let the algorithm know that history deserves an audience. Comment where you're watching from, because every city, every country, every listener is part of the same invisible map that stories like this travel across. We'll keep going deeper, into the missions never declassified, the operatives who lived and disappeared, the decisions that shaped the century behind closed doors. Because history doesn't hide, it waits to be found. Your curiosity drives this mission, and as long as you keep asking questions, the silence that protects power will never be complete.